you so much for joining us this evening for the 10th and penultimate Yoval program. Throughout the year, the Yoval program has looked at issues of racism in terms of history and societal situations. But tonight, we will look at these issues specifically and how they affect our community. Tonight, we're honored to be able to host Chava Shervington, who is a lawyer by profession and is a leading voice and activist in the movement to recognize the growing diversity within the Jewish community. The recently released Pew study cited a statistic that 15% of Jews under the age of 30 identify as a race or an ethnicity other than non-Hispanic white. And in addition, 29% of them live in households in which at least one child is non-white or multiracial. So this conversation tonight with Jewish Center and Yoval Planning Committee member Marnie Black could not be more timely. And so now we'll begin, and I'll introduce Chava and Marnie. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Virginia. So as Virginia said, this is sort of a very interesting moment for us to be having this conversation with everything going on in Israel, seeming rises of incidences of anti-Semitism in the United States. Next week marks the 1 year, feels odd to say anniversary, so the 1 year mark since George Floyd's murder. As Virginia noted, the Pew study that shows the changing demographics of our communities. So I hope that this will be an interesting and provocative conversation, against that backdrop. So Chava, I'd love to just start by talking about your experience of being a Jew of color in the Orthodox community. The Jewish community is hardly alone when it comes to grappling with the problem of racism. And as Orthodox Jews, we're so focused on outreach and personal growth. So I'd imagine that we need to be especially concerned, particularly given the Pew numbers, with any behavior that would alienate any Jew from Orthodox observance and community. So can you talk a little bit about your experience, both negative and positive?
Sure. So I just want to reiterate, thank you for having this conversation. I think it's really important. I think in the context of the world happenings around us, it kind of reemphasizes the importance of this conversation in a lot of ways. And with regard to my experience, I think that, look, there's a lot of really beautiful things about the Frum community. Chesed, right? Like when I have 3 children, every single one, community, meals, love a good meal train. When you ever need support in any way, hey, do you need someone to watch your kids? Do you need someone to borrow this? Our community is wonderful when it comes to, taking advantage of opportunities of chesed, of learning. I'm an active yeshiva parent and very active in, girls programming at the shul that I attend. But that also comes with being a Black Orthodox Jew comes with also specific challenges or unique experiences, which in some ways always mark you as an outsider in the community, whether it's people staring at you when you're eating in a kosher restaurant, and not just like the quick stare, you'll have children come to your table and stare at you like the entire time while you're eating. You'll have sometimes from stores won't want to buzz you in. You'll show up to events and you'll have, people whispering, why is the goita here? Why is the shorta here? All of those, kind of like the little whispers. There's the absence of your existence. There's nowhere where you see yourself in the community. None of the frum books have any, have children of color in them. So you're constantly tasked with going outside of the community to see yourself, to have issues that impact you discussed. It's very new that we're having like serious conversations around race and racism and how that impacts people of color in our community, in our community, right? There's the way in which a lot of yeshiva day schools and teachers and people who work in our institutions are not trained or don't have exposure of how to deal with racist bullying or incidents that arise. So it often means that nothing happens or situations get perpetuated. And, and I tell people this all the time, there's a lot of my peers who are no longer in the community, some of which don't even identify as Jewish anymore because they got tired of fighting to be a Jew, right? If the community was going to see them as Black, Latina, Asian whenever they walked in the door, and that was going to be something that they would have to constantly, their Jewishness was something they were going to constantly have to validate. They're going to constantly have to improve. It's you're in a wedding, you're helping organize, you're running a kids program, and people are just like, wow, you say these Hebrew words so nicely. Like, it's just this constant, I was like, I'm running the Malava Malka. Do you think I can't say Malava Malka? It's this constant incredulousness when you're in spaces that just can be kind of like difficult to deal with. I'm a little bit more of an assertive personality, I'll say. So I feel an obligation, right, to own my space in this community. I'm a Jew. I deserve to be involved in Torah learning, in our school systems, in the Beit Knesset, to, go to a kosher restaurant, even to the Chol Hamoed programs and to watch Uncle Moishi with my kids. All of that I feel is my right? But I recognize that not everybody has that type of personality, that they're constantly interested in pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing just for some of the things that people take for granted. Right. My sister recently got married. I was talking to my new brother-in-law, who is not a Jew of color. And, we were talking about, like, why did you pick this shul versus that shul? And I said, that's when we were going to different shuls when we first moved to Los Angeles, it was a shul that we walked in and they treated my family like they were normal members of the community from the moment we walked in the door. And I said, this is for us. And he was like, that's it? Like, that was enough for you to say, this is where my family is going to be? And I said, that is rarer than you think. That experience of, my husband who wears a black hat and all of this stuff, walking into a space and automatically people going, come sit down. There's a seat here. My kids being swept up into kids programming without kind of funny looks. Me being asked to volunteer to kind of help with programming and shul engagement. Those things are rare. And so, that was what I was looking for. And I think that the fact that that's not a typical experience is really indicative of, I think, what a lot of Jews of color experience, and that you can find your space and you can, you know, be active and involved, but it takes pushing, and it takes like koach.
Yeah, sounds like it can be very tiring. So you talk a lot about moving the conversation about Jews of color from the superficial narrative, people's personal backgrounds and stories, and how did you become a Jew of color, to stories or programming, to building models for structural change. Can you talk a little bit about that and what that means?
Sure. So I'm happy to talk about the experience of Black Orthodox Jews in the context of these conversations, because I think it's a really important first step. A lot of folks do not realize, right, how different the experience of being a person of color in the Orthodox community can be from their own experience. So I think that it's a really important part of the initial conversation, right, to help people understand where those gaps are, where our community experiences tension with, you know, people of color and racism, and how this manifests specifically in our community. But then what's next, right? How do we shift those experiences? How do we create the kind of substantial change that is going to allow, you know, a Jew of color who just is born, goes to school, etc., to stay involved in our community, right? I tell people all the time, they're like, I don't understand, why aren't there more Jew of color rabbis and, you know, rebbitzins and this, that, etc. There are, but I tell them the reality is the biggest barrier to engage Jewish adults of color is elementary school. Most folks cannot get out of elementary school. Right? The amount of people I know who've had to pull their children out of the day school system because of bullying or confidence issues, and the school was completely ill-equipped to deal with them, of communities that were ignoring the issue or operating from kind of like a colorblind, everyone's just a Jew model, is beautiful in theory, right? But in actuality, it creates a situation in which certain folks are not being served because their needs aren't being addressed. And the issues that they face aren't being proactively dealt with. And so I think what we need to do now as a community is like, we're recognizing, we're wrestling with like this idea of racism, and both like in the larger world, and now we're talking about it like, okay, so like, let's talk tachlis, like how does this operate here? And this is our Dalet Amos. We have power and control in order to be able to create change in a way that we can't necessarily, you know, change the whole country, but we can change our community. And how do we do that? Like, what systems should we be putting into our teacher training? What books should we be putting into our classrooms? How should we be advocating for more diverse Jewish books and images? How can we be educating ourselves so that we're conversant in these issues and the history in our country, so that we don't make comments that maybe are racially tinged that we're just not aware of? It's part of it's education, and part of it is putting in kind of work to create some structures.
Yep, makes perfect sense. So that dovetails very nicely into my next question, which has to do with our schools. So our schools and our communities are not as diverse as the greater world, which can often lead to an entrenchment of stereotypes because we're not interacting with people necessarily of color day to day. So how do we, but in particular parents, communal leaders, educators, ensure that we are not perpetuating racial stereotypes?
So I think there's a couple of different things that we can be doing. One is educating ourselves. I think that sometimes we perpetuate racial stereotypes because we're not aware that they're racial stereotypes, or that there is a history to kind of how certain narratives were created. There is the removal, and this is going to take work. Everybody, this is hard, right? To be able to accept critique when offered. I think that it's really hard to hear that you're doing something that hurts someone. And a lot of times our response is, I didn't mean that, you're being too sensitive. And so we haven't gone deeper. We haven't said, let me kind of understand the impact that my words are bringing to someone else, and try and do better next time, or try to avoid this statement. We're just tossing it, kind of, which isn't helpful. I think that another thing that we need to do is to proactively engage with culture, or books or knowledge created by people of color. Look, I understand how difficult it is. I also, I live in a frum neighborhood. I have kids in frum schools, right? I have to work for my child to see people of color she is not related to. Right? I recognize the difficulty, but what does that mean? It means that I take advantage of cultural exhibits, books, art. I make sure that all of our conversations around people of color are not about race and racism, right? People of color contribute more to the world than being the victims of racism. And how do we talk about those contributions? Do we talk about those contributions? When people of color are discussed in ways that make them full people with active contributions to society, they become a lot harder to stereotype, right? There's all of these halachot around like the way that we talk to people or about people, and how can we utilize those tools to reframe the way in which we discuss people of color? How do we talk about ourselves, right? Do we utilize the juxtaposition of how other communities do things in order to validate certain ways in which we operate as the appropriate or right way, right? Do we avoid race, period? Right? So many of us are so nervous about making a mistake. We just do not talk about race at all, right? It is like this elephant in the room that everybody's ignoring. And when we don't talk about things, children often get the impression that those things are bad, right? Difference is not always bad. It's just different. And how do we as a community talk about difference? How do we relate to the concept of difference? In a lot of ways, the Orthodox community has conformity as a communal norm that we value, right? But what happens if, for whatever reason, you exist outside of the default, right? If your background is a little bit different, if your family background is a little bit different, if your path is a little bit different, how do we have conversations around that? Are those things seen as bad or negative, or are they just seen as different? Are they presented to our youth? Are they talked about in our community in ways where it doesn't seem like it's a dirty secret? How do we have those conversations around difference, and to proactively have conversations around difference? I know I have had people who are scheduled to go to my Shabbat meals, and I've been searching shul for them 30 minutes after davening. And they finally find me because someone drags them to me, and I said, I think this is who you're looking for. And I said, I don't understand. Where have you been? The shul's not that big. Where have you been? They're like, I was looking for you. And I was like, what do you mean you were looking for me? I was like, nobody told you I was Black? And they were like, no, no, they didn't. So you had someone who was running around the shul looking for someone who's relatively short, you know, a little on the chunky side with dark hair. I'm like, in a shul? You know, like, that's every woman in here. Of course she took 30 minutes to find me, right? Because everybody was so afraid to mention race, right? You know, when incidents, like even innocent incidents, kids ask questions, right? We see this around, you know, kind of disabilities and all kinds of other issues, right? Kids know that I'm brown, right? You avoiding that conversation just makes it weird for everyone, right? So when your kid says, mommy, why is she brown, right? Then how do we have that conversation? Are we prepared to have that conversation? That's a really important just learning tool. How do we talk to kids about race and racism from an early age? Because like there's a ways to have conversations around difference, around fairness from a very early age. And we need to integrate this into the way in which we have communal conversations.
Yep. I want to note for everybody that in about 20 minutes, we're going to take some audience questions. So just add them to the chat and we will get to them in about 20 minutes. In the meantime, you touched on this a little bit, but I'd love to sort of dig in. You know, this year has been, you know, very fraught for many people, and we are so afraid to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing when we're discussing race. Yet I do think that many of us want to engage and learn more. So how would you suggest we proceed, and what internal work might we all need to do to become more comfortable engaging in discussions about race?
So I think that there's a couple of like really important kind of like emotional first steps that a lot of us have to get through, right? And one is accepting some of the things that we assume are just not reality, right? They're not reality for everyone, right? Which is a hard thing to accept, right? You operate in the world the way in which you operate. You engage with the world the way in which you engage with the world. And so therefore, there are certain assumptions that you accept about the way people engage with you, around the way that systems work, around the way that opportunities are extended, right? Or not extended, or around barriers that you expect or don't expect, right? And there's just a recognition that everybody does not have the same barriers, right? And part of that can be really, really hard because so much of that is integrated into our concepts of fairness and our own concepts of our own hard work and like all of the things that we've done in order to get to where we are, right? And if life's not fair and I've accomplished things, then what does that mean? It doesn't mean that you didn't work hard to get where you were. Does it mean your parents didn't work hard to get where they are? Does it mean your grandparents didn't work hard to get where they are? It means that there were certain types of challenges that were not challenges that they encountered to their success, right? And I kind of utilize this somewhat awkward analogy, but the subway. I used to live in New York up until 4 years ago. I was a queen of the subway. You couldn't put me in a car. If it was only 2 subway stops, I was like, I'm not walking it, I'm getting on the train. And then I had a baby and I had a stroller. And all of a sudden, the easy to navigate, really accessible subway system that took me everywhere I wanted to go got infinitely more complicated. And I had to plan out where I was going because I wanted the subway stop with the elevator. And now I had to take this train or this train, and it became a lot more complicated. It didn't mean that like I wasn't schlepping up the stairs the first time, or, you know, I didn't pay my Metro card fare. It meant that I recognized that there were challenges to the subway system that I was not aware of until I had a baby and pushed a carriage. And at that point, I became incredibly aware of how I had never had to think about this. Mm-hmm. And the first thing I said was, how do people in wheelchairs operate the New York City subway? Mm-hmm. And it created an incredibly just like new reality in my head, right? And sometimes it happens, right? When, let's say, your spouse marries a Jew of color, your child marries a Jew of color, or somebody adopts a Jew, whatever it is, right? You now have a person of color in your household, and you become aware of racism in a different way because you start to see the ways in which it impacts their life. We don't all have the benefit of personal experience, right, to shift our worldview. So part of this is just acknowledging, right, that my experience is not universal. And so I need to operate with a level of humbleness to understand the way in which other people's experiences of maybe the same set of circumstances are different, which I think is really important. Mm-hmm. The second is, I'm a child, of the 80s. I remember when the goal was colorblindness, right? We're going to be like a Gap ad of racial equality in America, and we're still going to all wear Gap clothes, right? Like nothing is going to change. We're just going to put like different colored people in all of these situations. And that was the goal because there's no difference, right? There's no difference. It's just, like there's no difference. We just have to not say mean things. We just have to not do bad things. But the reality is there are certain default assumptions on which our society runs. And so there aren't just, kind of like me not saying anything bad is not the answer. That's part of the answer, right? And that's part of the way that racism works. But also, we have different experiences. We have different cultures, right? If someone said, we're all going to work 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, that is a colorblind, that is completely equitable, or not equitable, is a completely same, it's completely equal job schedule. But we know as Orthodox Jews that when Friday rolls around in November and December, that no longer becomes it's not equitable, right? We have needs that a 9 to 5, Monday through Friday schedule does not always serve.
Yeah.
Right. And so we have to acknowledge, right, that just as we have special needs because of our practice as Orthodox Jews, there might be needs that other communities have that are tied to the historical inequalities or of the ways in which our society has created inequitable results. And so that is a way I think it would be helpful to think about it. And so I think that those are kind of like, and then also to recognize that part of dealing with racism and understanding racism is also understanding that we might not be the best arbiters of what racism is, right? We don't need anybody to tell us what anti-Semitism is, right? We don't want to hear any, and I think a lot of us are feeling in this moment, right? That other people don't get to decide what anti-Semitism is, right? We know it when we see it. We have a firm understanding and grounding in tropes and historical realities that a lot of people are just not attuned to. And so they cavalierly say, that is not anti-Semitism. And we are looking at them and saying, you, my friend, are incorrect. That is actually classic anti-Semitism that has been utilized throughout history to justify X, Y, and Z practices. And so I think also with like this concept of race and racism, we sometimes feel like we know what racism is or what racism isn't. And we have to, which can be super difficult, right, is to let others own that definition, right? That just like we know what anti-Semitism is and feels like, people of color know what racism is and feels like. And we need to follow their lead when they are providing us with those definitions. And understand that, right, intention and impact are different, right? Like when somebody makes a comment about maybe that outfit, they might not have meant to hurt your feelings, right? But they could have hurt your feelings. And so them saying they didn't hurt your feelings isn't helpful. You're saying, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that hurt your feelings. Like, I'll avoid that or I'll do something different in the future. And I think those are like key, just like underpinnings of how this conversation is approached that will drastically help people's ability to even learn and hear and do better.
Yep, very good advice. Chava, what do you think the Jewish responsibility is in a time post George Floyd to stand up to racism? I mean, we kind of, and again, you touched on this a little bit, but we know what to do to stand up to anti-Semitism. And, now, and again, I'm not suggesting that racism is new, but what is our responsibility as Jews to stand up against racism right now?
So I think that it's a little bit of a complicated question, right? Because a lot of these conversations have been sparked by George Floyd and the conversation, like the national outcry from that, right? But we had a responsibility like pre-existing that moment, right? It didn't spring from that moment. We became aware of what we weren't doing in that moment, right? And so our responsibility is one, just, and Virginia touched on this a little bit, like in the Pew study, there are people of color in our community, which means they are impacted by racism, right? I am, like we are, like my family is just as likely, or probably, I'll reframe that. My family is more likely to be impacted by virulent racism, like if somebody sees us walking down the street, then anti-Semitism. I mean, also my husband's in the military, like people generally, like if they're looking for like an anti-Semitic target, don't pick like a buff Black man. But like the reality is, right, every male in my family has been accosted by police. Every, my cousin has a doctorate, married, 4 kids, has almost been killed by cops 3 times. My father on the way to like a wedding gets stopped by the cops constantly. My father drives so slow, it's frustrating. He is the person you're going around always. Because he doesn't speed, because he doesn't like to give people an excuse, and he drives a luxury car, right? And even with him going like 50 miles an hour exactly, inevitably he gets pulled over. And where are you going? What are you doing? Prove this car is yours, right? When I was a kid in my neighborhood, because we were the only one of 2 Black families in my neighborhood, the cops used to follow me home from the bus. So these are conversations that impact people in our community. right? And so when we ignore them, when we have these cavalier conversations, when we want to have an academic discourse, what are you saying about issues that impact my life? You know, when there was all of the stuff happening this summer, right? How do Jewish communities respond to it, right? A lot of times it's by beefing up security, and it's about people arming themselves. And there's all of these conversations around security and ways in which what makes us safer, what doesn't make us safer. You know, I'll table that. But there's the reality that these people are not necessarily, like, we aren't talking to our security about, hey, there might be a Black person who walks in the door. So who are they expecting when they walk in? How will those people get treated, right? You know, when we have our community groups that are looking for people who don't belong, or people who are up to no good, or being actively, you know, active in kind of surveying the neighborhood, who are they singling out? How are they singling them out? You know, I was more like, my husband, you know, we live in a very Jewish neighborhood. You know, my husband has PT tests. He does not run on the streets of my neighborhood because he is nervous that someone is going to think he stole something and he's running. Like, you know, I was incredibly nervous that somebody was going to see him out and about when all of this stuff was happening. And I was just like, you know, I was like, do not go, you know, when stuff happens, I'm like, go to our shul, no other shul. I don't want you to go to a kiddush. I don't want you to go to a bris. I don't want you to go anywhere, but where you're supposed to, where people know who you are. And how that is when you're operating from space. And so I think that we have to kind of internalize that these are not foreign problems. These are not problems that happen to other people. They are problems that happen to people in our community. And how are we adopting community norms? And how are we talking about people of color in our community in ways that can cause them harm or create a greater lack of safety? And so I think that there's that responsibility. And also, just like, look, part of Torah, part of the mitzvot is to make us better people, right? When we are operating in a way, right, that people look at from people and like, oh, they're racist, right? Like, that's a chol Hashem, right? If people's like presumption about from people is they're racist, then, you know, and people say, oh, these people are so religious, but this is how they treat me, right? I'm not the only person that doesn't get, I'm not the only Black person who doesn't get buzzed into like the Frum baby clothing store, right? There's a person who's also not getting buzzed into the Frum baby clothing store that has no positive experiences with the Frum community to counterbalance those instances, right? And so, like, I have a plethora of positive experiences in the Frum community. I have a lot of friends, family, etc. So I can say that's that person, that's, you know, maybe this community isn't the right place for me, etc. But that's an entirely different situation when, you know, you don't have that counter experience, right? And you know, if we are not kinder, more equitable, like, what do we, you know, there's kind of like part of it we need to kind of reevaluate, right? Like, you know, I always tell people, like, there's a lot of times where people are a lot more concerned with what goes in their mouth than what comes out of it. You know, I mean, if you think about how many little things we are careful about on Shabbat, right? Like, it's like, if you really were to break it down, it's crazy. We're like people who have OCD, like, it's bananas, right? Like how many little things that we are doing in advance and this and that, and because God forbid I should turn the light switch. Like it's bananas, right? So why, God forbid, can we not have like the same mentality of like, what can I be doing to not hurt another person? So that when they interact with me, they come away with a positive experience. They feel supported by me and my community. Like, how are we building relationships so that we can have, more sustained conversations on a lot of things? Like, I think that there's just so many ways in which our community has a responsibility. And part of it is born out of like, what does it mean to be a Kiddush Hashem? Mm-hmm. What is the point of all of our learning, of all of our fine tuning, of all of our focusing on midot and chesed, if nobody else sees it or acknowledges it or understands that it exists? Right. And also if we're operating in a way where we are alienating people in our community. The amount of people I know who have been watching community WhatsApps and reevaluating friendships, right? Like the way in which you respond to some of these, kind of incidents that happen with police also makes people feel like if, God forbid, right, something happened to my husband, what would your response be? What would your inclination be? How would you perpetuate, and I think that those are things that we need to think about.
Yep, absolutely. Very well said. So post George Floyd, we had a lot of discussions in my workplace about the role of our Black employees and their role in this conversation. And many shared that they felt an unwelcome burden to teach me and our other white employees about what it's like to live in America as a Black person. And they did not want to take on that burden. And others felt it was their obligation and embraced anyone who wanted to learn. And others explained it was the combination of the two. And I would imagine there's a real burden and obligation that you must feel as a Black Orthodox communal leader to teach about your lived experience. So how much of it do you feel is a burden and how much do you embrace that role? And does it come naturally to you or do you feel like it's something you have to do?
I feel like it's something that has evolved over time. I mean, like there was a large part of my life where I was just like, don't bother me. I'm just trying to be here, right? I'm not here to be your spokesperson, you're this, you're that. But through kind of some of the informal connections and organizing I was doing with Jews of color, I started to realize that we're all having the same experience, which is crazy, right? Like if we live in different parts of the country, we have different hashkafas, we have different backgrounds, right? We have different family structures, single, whatever it is. And we can bond over, unfortunately, like racism in some ways in our community, then there's a problem. And when you see people who are leaving the community because they've had enough, like the way in which we talk about at-risk kids and this and that, whatever, like you should not be an at-risk Jew because you are of a different race. Like that's crazy, right? Like we, have all these things about every neshama, this, that, whatever. Like we're paying how much are some of us paying in tuition to ensure that our Masorah is carried on for another generation. And there are people leaving just because of ignorance. And, I'm a little bit of a vocal person. So I was more comfortable with saying, look, I will step into this role in this space, in this space, in this space. Mm-hmm. And it kind of morphed into what I'm doing now. But also my sister is a very different person. Mm. When people are like, I want to talk about racism, she's like, you have the wrong sister. Mm. Like, I'm not the one. Go talk to my sister. Like, my husband has zero interest, right? Mm. He's like, you're the one who's gonna teach people, you know, people like, oh, I want to talk to you and you can like talk to my child or whatever. He's like, no. Right? We contemplated moving to Atlanta and he was like, the people are too friendly. I like Brooklyn where I can be ignored like everybody else. That's my goal. So to teach people about racism, never, right? But what I will say is, right, that it's important to have Jews of color involved in these conversations and leading these conversations, but also not expect them to want to talk about racism, right? Not everybody has an interest in racism. Like, racism is not a hobby, right? Like, maybe people like, you know, Musser, or they like, you know, crafting or whatever it is, but like, racism is not the thing that they want to talk about. So I think that one, we need to just like honor that. But two, when people are extending themselves to say, hey, this is a communal issue that we should talk about, to respect, say like, all right, they're willing to put themselves out there. Like, let's have like a real conversation. Mm-hmm. Look, I try to be very frank with people and also sensitive to the fact that this is not an easy thing to talk about, to change. But also, you know, and also I create spaces where I don't talk about it. Like, if I'm at a PTA meeting, you know, I also am like, also, I just want to tell you about racism. Like, you know, like sometimes I just do the mommy, you know, whatever. But, and so I think there's a time and space for it. And I try and carve those spaces out very intentionally, where this isn't kind of like, I'm like the racism person in the neighborhood. Probably am at this point, but like, I try to also do other things, you know? So it is in some ways a burden, because part of it is, I feel like I have to show up at this event at the Federation or that event, because like, if I don't show up, is a Jew of color going to be there? And are they going to have their voice heard? You know, if there's like a problematic image in the sitter that they send our kids home with, the other parents aren't going to say anything until I say something. So, you know, and also kind of like, how can we lift that burden, right? Like, what are the ways in which the person of color, like the Jew of color, does not have to be the only one to say something? You know, if somebody makes a racist statement and everybody looks at me like, aren't you going to address that? And I'm like, there's 20 people in this room. Right. Like, why am I the person who has to address it all of the time?
Yep. We're going to take a couple of audience questions. Feel free to continue to chat them in. This question: is diversity a value we should pursue when Judaism, as many other religions, are built around protecting our traditions and remaining insular? I.e., does Judaism value our modern day definition of diversity, or does it value adherence to Torah, halakha, and tradition?
So I think those things are posited as a contradiction, and I don't think they are. Right? I think that like, there are plenty of ways in which we, Can people still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, my computer just did something strange. I think there are plenty of ways in which we honor difference, right? It's just a difference we choose to honor, right? There is a very big difference between like the Jewish Center and Satmar Shul in Williamsburg. There is a very big difference between, you know, Syrians and Persians and Bukharians and Russians. There's a lot of difference within our community. that we honor within the context of tradition and halacha. This is just expanding who we see as an authentic part of that difference, right? Like there are Jamaican Jews and, you know, Jews from different parts of the world, you know, like Indian Jews, whatever, like those are not Jews that we talk about. Those aren't people that we consider like outside of Israel, like in a real way, right? And so how do we honor the difference that exists, right? I'm not like making up a difference that doesn't already exist and isn't growing, right? Yeah. We're talking about how do we give space to honor the diversity that exists within our community, the same way we do other types of diversity within our community.
Yep, makes perfect sense. So the next question, wow, super impressed. Are there any resources that you can point to that we can print out to help us discuss this further with our families, etc.?
So I recently founded an organization called Kamocha to specifically talk about, to have this conversation in the Orthodox community. And we are going to be coming out with resources that will be specifically kind of pertinent to our community, that will get released soon. But there are a host of, you know, other organizations that do print like materials out. I think that some of that's really helpful. Some of it might just be like diversifying your book collection. It might be looking at, you know, kind of some racial equity websites and resources. I'm happy to like provide some. I really like this book, The Color of Law. I mean, it's a lawyer in me also, but it talks about like the intentional kind of racial inequity that was built into certain legal structures in our country that have a real impact into kind of like housing and wealth inequity. So I think it's just like a really important like background conversation for understanding that, but it's a kind of like a big book.
Yep. Next question, Chava, your description of the situation is very clear. How would you design a course of learning for families to develop discussions and awareness around racial issues, including, as you pointed out, discussing persons of color who have made contributions in contrast to defining people of color by the anti-Black actions Blacks must defend against or are victimized by? As well, we need to create discussions where we examine and deconstruct the historical and institutional constructs that have created the baseline for these conditions. How can we bring these discussions into the community as a norm? That's like a multi-part question.
Okay. So I'm just going to repeat the first part of the question to make sure I understood it. Is how do we integrate these conversations into our families? Is that?
I think so. Yeah. And I think,
and just generally, and
I think how do we find the sort of sources that you talked about, you personally sort of,
utilize.
Yeah, utilize.
So I think that part of the thing is just integrating into the way we have conversations around everything, right? So I always say that like our school systems treat Black people like the first time travelers, where they exist in like slavery and civil rights and nowhere else. And when we're having conversations around the Revolutionary War, there's opportunities to talk about, the impact of Black folks in the colonial period. When we talk about science, there's opportunities to talk about Black inventors and Black creators. When we talk about like a lot of different things, part of it is just thinking about who we talk about, like who are like our go-tos, right? Of folks who we introduce to our children, and broadening that. there's a Smithsonian now that's really exciting that didn't exist when I was a kid. Yeah. It has a host of resources. There are a lot of lists now around diverse books with that talk about different individuals and or different stories. It's kind of, I don't want to just like kind of recite lists that like we're gonna have to like write down, and I'm happy to send around some
maybe we'll try to
later.
Get a list from you.
Yeah, and if you could remind me of the last half of that question, I apologize.
No, I think, how can these discussions be brought into the community as a norm?
So part of it is, right, if you are a faculty member or administrator at a school, right, when you're starting to talk about curriculum or school policies, do you have anti-discrimination policies? Do your teachers have training on how to deal with incidents of racial bias or racial incidents? Do they have kind of implicit bias training when they think about, they learn about maybe biases that they subconsciously hold that might even be like very different from the things that they actively value, right? When you have shul meetings on security, who do you envision as the people you're securing? Incorporating people of color as to the members of your community that you are as kind of integral members of the community that you're considering when you're having communal conversations. And part of that is, it's going to be a muscle, right? It's the same way in which, there are conversations around gender equity, and like when we have an event, like, where do the women sit? Do they have women panelists? All of those conversations that have started to become a thing and a part of our consciousness. How do we build a similar consciousness around Jews of color?
Yeah. Chava, I've enjoyed this conversation so much. Thank you. I know I learned a lot. So thank you very much. Thank you for giving us your time and your wisdom. Virginia, I know, I think I'm passing to you for some final announcements.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much, Chava and Marnie. This was really an incredibly thoughtful and enlightening conversation. And I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone who's been part of it has as well, and how to look at these situations and the guidance you've given us. It's really important. The whole effort of this Yoval programming this year has really been to initiate these kinds of conversations within the Jewish Center community. And so you've really contributed so richly to it, and we're so appreciative. I have one important reminder for everybody, but before I do that, I just would like to pause, and on behalf of my co-chair, Ora Weinbach, and myself, and on behalf of everyone who's participated throughout the year in these Yoval programs, I just want to extend a big thank you to Rabbi Levine and to the planning committee, who were the ones who really spent hours on Zoom calls starting last summer in order to plan these sessions, to think about which topics would be of interest, and to present a broad number of people and ideas. So thank you so much to the planning committee. Secondly, to our host committee, because before each event, they got into action to try to spread the word so that we would have the wonderful attendance that we've had. And of course, thank you to all the sponsors, because that's enabled us to bring such respected voices, such as Chava and all the others, to our community. And so all of you who've taken part in this program, there are too many to mention individually, but we really want to acknowledge you and thank you for your work and your contributions to making this Yoval program happen throughout the year. And the last piece I want to say is a quick reminder to please mark your calendars for June 9th at 7 p.m. when we're going to have the annual May and Samuel Rudin lecture, which will be in conjunction with Yoval. And we have the distinct honor of presenting the Honorable Deval Patrick, former two-term governor of Massachusetts, also a lawyer, activist like Chava, lawyer and activist, and a businessman. And he will be in conversation with Rabbi Levine on the topic of race and American society. So if you want to be a part of that, and we hope you do, you can sign up on the Jewish Center website. So we are 2 minutes over, so I'm going to end here with a big thank you to everybody and hope you all have a good night. Thank you.